All right, what is up, coders? I am Luke here at Covalence, and this walkthrough is going to be taking us through how to use React hooks with TypeScript. And in particular, we're going to focus mostly on one hook, just UseState, and the other one being UseEffect, the two most common ones you're going to be using, and you already have encountered them in the React section of our curriculum here. So now we're going to be taking that knowledge and trying to apply it here in TypeScript instead, if you prefer writing functional components like I do. So I think as a good starting off point, we're going to take this basic class-based component that has a constructor with a state object with a property of name that will be a string. Right now it's defined as null. And it makes a lifecycle method call to an API endpoint and sets that state of name to say pretty much just hello world. And this is kind of a fresh clone of our bare bones React TypeScript Express boilerplate. I've done some work, a little bit of work on the back end to have two more API endpoints just for this demo here. And some components that I'll be wiring up later. They have some stuff commented out and some code needed inside of them so we can discuss TypeScript and hooks. But they're mostly just with a bunch of bootstrap styling, just so I don't finagle with that during the walkthrough. It's kind of, it's kind of like up to you and how you style these things. So I made it look at least halfway decent for the walkthrough, but we're going to be talking more about the logic behind them and less about the bootstrap styling to get them done. So looking what this result is here right now, it's just a nice hello world. Hello comes from the React component, and world comes from the backend API of our fetch call here. So let's go ahead and start breaking this guy down from a class-based component into a functional component. First thing we're going to have to do is definitely convert it from class to function. So let's start up top here. Delete that whole line entirely, and we're going to say, hey, we're going to have a const function called app. We need to type what type of function this app is, aka a React .sfc, and SFC is for stateless functional component, and it needs a prop generic here since this guy is going to be built with, so our iappprops is perfect from down there below. Now that it's typed, we can say this guy will be built with some props or not. If you don't want any, it doesn't really matter at this point. We don't have any props to worry about. So yeah, there we go. We're done here. Something else to keep in mind is there is no need for a render method inside of a functional component. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that there. All we need is a return that returns some amount of JSX. So right now we're good to go. Now there are no lifecycle methods in React functional components. So I'm going to convert this guy to just be a functional asynchronous component. And we'll call it const GetName will be an asynchronous function, boom, that runs the very same fetch, response JSON, and runs a set state. But we're going to be changing that later once we have our proper setter function from our UseState hook. We also don't need a constructor function inside of functional components. That's going to be gone there along with that super. And this state object will also be converted to our hook here in just a moment. So as of right now, it's some pretty good pace we got going on here. So let's go ahead and bring in our necessary UseState and UseEffect hooks from the React library. Nope, not range parser, React. There we go. So here's where we're going to take our state object and convert it just to be, a flat string name, the same type of property we have going on down here. So all I got to do is say our const ES6 array destructuring, where we get to destructure our state and setter function for that state. We'll call it name and set name, makes sense to me. And we're going to call our UseState hook and pass it in a default value of a blank string. Now, if you want to have type safety on what this UseState value is supposed to return, we can just go ahead and pass in a generic type here of string to our UseState function, as that's what it's going to be returning. So now name is safely typed. And we don't even need to have this extra interface down here if we don't want to. Now, if your UseState is going to be an array of objects or an object itself, we can take advantage of these interfaces here provided to us. But we're going to get into that a little bit later in this video. So I'm going to go ahead and delete that interface right there, and we're just about there. So rather than calling this .setState, I'll be calling setName. And I don't have to be setting name to an object of any kind with that property name. All it needs to be is literally a name like that, a flat name string, which is what this should be returning. And down here, I don't have to reference this .state.name anymore. All I got to do is reference hello name. So next thing we need to do is use our GetName function inside of a UseEffect. And if you guys recall from the previous React hooks video, when we're talking about plain JavaScript, when I had that create React app demo going, I mentioned that we cannot use the asynchronous keyword here on UseEffect as it is typed to return a function within another function. So they're both voids, and asynchronous functions return an implicit promise. So we can't type async there. We're going to have to use a helper function if you want to use that syntax. So if you recall, this useEffect returned an optional cleanup function, which is also just returning some code. That's another void type, and this is also a void type. So we actually don't have to type useEffect at all for TypeScript. It's actually very simple to get up and running. So I'm going to go ahead and call our GetName function here. So that should hopefully get and set the name from our API, and we end up with the exact same result on the front end. And the only thing I'm missing is I see app is dimmed out here. I'm going to have to remember to export default my app at the bottom down here. So there we go. We should be back up and running to the exact same thing we had a second ago. So with any luck, a refresh here produces the same result. All right, cool. That was a fun little foray of converting just a very simple class-based component into a functional component and showing how simple it is to use TypeScript with the React Hooks API. Now, there are other hooks that do require some more typing, but these two hooks are going to be kind of like your bread and butter tools in this curriculum to get your labs done. So let's go ahead and convert this app to take advantage of those two components I have for a list of albums and an album details. That's the idea here. Our goal is I have an API set up to return some of my favorite albums, and we're going to have a list of albums where we can click on a button that links to another component that will show their details. So let's go ahead and build that out. I actually won't need anything here in my app anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and remove those. We will, however, need a couple things from React Router DOM, which I had installed previous to this video. So we actually have other video walkthroughs in our curriculum of how to install React Router DOM and its types and its references and stuff like that. So we're going to bring in our browser router. We're going to need a switch and some routes to use. So let's get going. At this point in the curriculum, you probably written this a couple times, and so there's nothing really we're going to have to discuss too quick. So I'm going to write this out fairly quickly here. There we go. And that's where we're going to have our route that will be using the exact path of home. And the component it will be loading will be my albums component. There we go. And I'll go ahead and import albums from this directory /components/albums. And similarly, I'm going to have one called for details like that. And yeah, so all we have to do is import details from this component /details like that. And from there, all we have to do is type in the path. I chose to have a route param called ID and a path afterwards called details to differentiate from the home route. They'll load that component. So that's actually all we need to do here inside of my app.tsx. It should be about good to go. We're going to be using the Bootstrap container, and I'm going to go ahead and make sure that's moved inside of the browser router now that I think about it, because typically you may want to make sure your browser router is the parent most level component in order to take advantage of the props it provides for your whole application. So you got to make sure browser router is the parent most exported or parent most returned component. So now we should be good to go. I don't think this will actually render anything to the front page. It's blank at the moment. So let's go ahead and dive on into the components themselves of albums and details. So over here in the albums component, I have a basic little section row set up inside of my container, and I have a unordered list with some styling on it so we can get something showing up on the page. Now I'm going to fetch some information from my API, and I'm gonna need to set it to state. So I'm gonna go ahead and import both those bread and butter hooks, as I call them, and they're definitely gonna be your bread and butter. So import useEffect from React, there we go. We have my generic for my props here for the component. If I needed to safe type anything like React component props, we can do so here, but I don't think I'll need those props on this particular component. So first thing we need to do is set up our state. Let's go ahead and do that together. So I'm going to use my ES6 destructuring. We'll have something called albums and set albums as my setter function. That is going to call the UseState hook, where I'm going to pass in a blank array initially. And if you want to have some really nice type safety, let's go ahead and code out what the type is going to be. It's going to be an array of my album objects. So I know these properties because I wrote this API and its response, so I know what it's going to look like. So all you have to do is just look at your API response. Typically, if it's like a JSON, an array of objects, all you have to do is at least type one of those objects. So if you guys recall from earlier in the curriculum, we did that Studio Ghibli lab where we had a lab that responded with an array of film objects, and each film object had a certain number, the same type of properties on them, and that's where I'm getting this information from. So I'm going to actually export this interface so I can use it potentially somewhere else in my application, maybe in the details component later on. And I'm going to call it, one album. That makes sense to me. And it's going to be an object of the following properties. It has an ID that's going to be a number. It's going to have a title that will be a string. It'll have an artist that's also a string. That's fairly common stuff here. Hopefully not too bad. I had a URL that's also a string. A lot of these are going to be just string values on this particular demo. I had an image URL, which is going to be a string as well. I had something called a thumbnail underscore image. It's also a string. And finally, I think I have an underscore created that is a date for when this was inserted in my database, which probably won't be too relevant here in this demo. But there you go. There's typing one album object that we can take advantage of now. So I can say, hey, I'm going to be using an album object, and this array will be an array of those album objects. So now we have some really cool type safety going on here on our albums. It recognizes that it's going to be an array of album objects. So we can take advantage of TypeScript here in IntelliSense, helping us finish these properties and to pass them around. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and do just like we did in the previous video. We'll have something called const_getAlbums. Will be an asynchronous function that will try and say, let's get and await a fetch request to /API/albums. Should get me my list of albums. We're going to convert that to a local variable called albums off our response.json conversion, where I'll call my setAlbums function and pass in the local value of albums, and we're good to go. Now with my use effect, just like before, I'm going to recall this function inside of here, and I'll just do it on one line just to save a little bit of space here. Const_getAlbums. There we go. Should be good to go. And now if albums is set to state, I should be able to map through that piece of state. Albums.map. And for each individual album object, I'm going to do an implicit return here where I will use an li. And this li will have to have a key of album.id, and there's our type safety kicking on with IntelliSense there. I'm going to give it a little bit of styling here for Bootstrap. We'll make these guys list group items to make them look nice. I'll have two things inside of this list item, a title and a button as my goal. So I'm going to turn this into a flexbox container as well. We're going to justify the content center. Like so. No, we'll do between. Center might be looking kind of, we'll do between. And then inside of my list item, I'll have the two things, or I'll have maybe like, we'll do like an H3. I don't know why it took me so long to think of a decent example. For the H3, that's I'm going to render the title of the album, so album.title. And right below that, I'm actually going to be using a link to go to the other components. So I'll have to import at the top here from React Router DOM. I'll bring in my link component like that, and I'll be using it next side by this H3 like so, and these guys have to have a to, and this is where it's going to be dynamically going to a path of /album.id, so I can pass that across a route param so I can fetch a singular album for this demo, /details, which I got from this path here if you recall. And from there, I'm going to give it a little bit of styling as well, because, why not, right? We're going to make it look like a button info from default Bootstrap, give it a little bit of shadow over there, and then maybe, I don't need actually margin. I shouldn't need any margin. Okay, so I will call it get details or something like that. So with that coded out, let's see what my progress now looks like. Cool, looks like I forgot some class name on the list group item. Oh, I called it items. It's supposed to be item for Bootstrap, so whoops. There we go, that's a little bit cleaner. That's what I was looking to do. So now I want to click on one of these buttons, and you'll notice it takes me to a blank card at the moment. It just says go back, and that go back button doesn't do anything. Remember, I just coded these guys out stylistically so they look good for the demo. We're more focusing on the TypeScript and underlying logic of how to utilize it. So there you go. We have now made our get all albums component ready to go with some type safety, and I'm actually exporting this interface because it's going to be proving very useful coming up here in a second. So now we're going to jump into my details component. I am passing, if you guys recall, a route parameter called ID across this route. So I can take advantage of that inside of my details component. So if I want type safety on my props, I'm going to have to import. Actually, I think we can do this with one line by just saying extends route component props. And because I have TypeScript and my IntelliSense kicking on, we can go ahead and just extend the route component props interface, and it automatically does the import up top for us. And this is where I pass in my match object generic, which will be something called ID passed as a string, and there we go. So if I want to do some fancy ES6 destructuring, if I don't want to have to write props.match.params.id, I can go in here in my function call and say, hey, I want to destructure props. Off of that, I want something called match. Match has something called params, and off of that I want to destructure something called ID. So now instead of having to write props.match.params.id, I can reference just ID and be good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing up top here, where I'll bring in my bread and butter tools of UseState and UseEffect from the React library, like so. Let's see if I can zoom out here. There we go. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing we did a second ago with our ConstantAlbum singular. I'll have a setAlbum setter function as well, where I'll call my UseState function, which will be an object right now. Because if you wanted to tackle it this way, this is what you're going to have to do. I'm going to have to say that my UseState should return an album piece of state that looks just like the object we typed here. So I'm actually going to import this interface for use in here to make my life easier. Because I see a lot of students retype and copy and paste interfaces across components when they can have maybe a file of types that they can use across their application. So I'll bring in one singular album from this directory /albums. You should recognize that export right there. So now I can say, hey, this type needs to be of type album. Now a lot of the time students get here and go, wait a minute, I typed it as the object, but why am I not getting is not assignable as type album? Well, this is a blank object without any of those properties that album is looking for. So with one of the things on TypeScript, we're going to have to come in here and actually just give these some default values. So we're going to go ahead and do that here. I'm just going to make all these, even if it's a string or a number, just give it a value of null until we make sure I have every single property accounted for. So we had URL, I think we had image, and then we had thumbnail image. Oops. Thumbnail image is null. And finally, our underscore created as null as well. And there you go. Now we have type safety set on this album object. So that's where I'm going to go ahead and do our usual asynchronous call. And this time I'll be doing a fetch call to a single API endpoint using template literals here, so we can reference /API/albums and then pass in dynamically our ID. And that's where our ES6 destructuring comes in handy, so I can just write this nice clean ID down here. So I'll say one singular album will be converted from this r.json. Then I can finally call setAlbum and set the local album, and we're good to go. From there, just like before, UseEffect. And in this case, I would say that it would make sense to give this, rather than a blank array dependency, let's say if the route parameter passes a new props.match.params.id to this component, it should rerun this UseEffect. I think that's a good dependency that we can say, when should this effect run? Well, when we get a new route parameter. That means we have to fetch a new album. So that's a really solid dependency we can use right there for a UseEffect. Because I think at this point in the curriculum, you've typically just had blank arrays. So there we go. So now if all this is set to state, I should be able to uncomment some of these things and everything should start working. So for example, if I uncomment my album image here, and my album title h4. So this is just rendering album.title. I have a source called album.image because I have all this stuff ready to go. Album artist should be good to go. This thumbnail image for the artist should be good to go. And this anchor tag should also be good to go. So let's check out what we got going on here. So if I refresh my application, and if everything rebuilt with Webpack, I can click on License to Ill by Beastie Boys and check it out, y'all. We now have used React TypeScript with the new hooks API just to get a feel for the basics of how to progress forward using this stuff. So that's awesome. So right now I can click on buy on Amazon and it should take me to a blank target reference. Awesome. So something cool I want to show you guys on this on click right here. I'm also going to destructure an object called history as well as match from props.history. So now down here, I can make this button run a callback function of say, hey, call history.goback. And that's provided to us by our browser router. And because this component is being routed to, and I have it type safetied up here and destructured up here, I don't have to reference props.history.goback. I can just say history.goback. So hopefully this button will now allow us to head back one component screen. So refresh the component here, good to go back, and we got it. So we can check out logic right here, and there you go. I love this album. Good stuff, y'all. So this has been a fun walkthrough on how to use TypeScript and React hooks. If you guys have any follow-up questions, as always, hit us up in the Gravity comments and questions, our Discord channels here in YouTube, for anything you guys like to see or learn more about how to use React hooks and TypeScript. So hope you guys enjoyed this walkthrough and have an awesome rest of your day.